Many of the listeners of this podcast are from Pakistan, and they often write to me asking me to discuss more books about Pakistan or books written by Pakistani authors. And I do say to them that where are those books? Because I can barely find any. But on a serious note, there are quite a few books, and when I see intellectual discussions from those of you who write to me regarding these books, I see that most of these discussions, they revolve around the identity of Pakistan and how this country was created. So you generally get two versions of this story. One is by Aisha Jalal and the other by Ishtiaq Ahmed. So you get two versions. One version says it was a good thing, it was because of India's fault that Pakistan was created, and the other version says that it wasn't such a good idea. So a lot of discussions that I see revolve around this particular topic about the identity, and you add to that the question of Islam, because then again you find two versions. One version says that it was created for Muslims, it's an Islamic state, and the other version states that it has to be a secular state, it was created for minorities of India, and it was supposed to protect those minorities, and it's not really an Islamic state. And then a lot of things happened along the way in political sphere of Pakistan, so eventually it became Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So there is a lot to unpack when it comes to the identity question of Pakistan. And that's why I've got this book with me, which is called Making Sense of Pakistan. It's written by Farzana Shaikh, and it's a really interesting account of this identity question and the narratives around it. And at the same time, the book sees the consequences or the results of this confusion in identity, how it socially impacts Pakistanis, how it impacts the economy of the country, all these different spheres, even the foreign policy and politics. So it's an interesting read, and I'm going to read a few pages from this book, from two or three different chapters, and that will give you some idea what this book is all about and what is the author trying to say here. So let me start with the first chapter, which says, Why Pakistan? History and Ideology. So let's start. It is well known that the term Pakistan, an acronym, was originally thought up in England by a group of Muslim intellectuals. P for the Punjabis, A for the Afghans, K for the Kashmiris, S for the Sindh, and the Tan they say for Baluchistan. No mention of the East-West. You notice Bangladesh never got its name in the title, and so eventually it took the hint and seceded from the secessionists. So it was a word born in exile, which then went east, was born across or translated, and imposed itself on history. A returning migrant settling down on partitioned land, forming a palimpsest on the past. A palimpsest obscures what lies beneath. To build Pakistan, it was necessary to cover up Indian history, to deny that Indian centuries lay just beneath the surface. Can history settle the fundamental matter of Pakistan's raison d'etre? Many in Pakistan have no doubt that it can. Many others, and not just its detractors, claim it cannot. What is indisputable and remarkable is that the question should still be asked even as Pakistan settles into middle age, more than 60 years after its creation in 1947. But why should an inquiry into the historical meaning of Pakistan be at all relevant for an understanding of its present dilemmas or indeed its future course? To answer this question is to acknowledge the profound conviction among its people that Pakistan's purpose has been ill served, indeed, that something has gone wrong with the country's history. Yet, few are willing to scrutinize that history for fear that it will shred the fragile national palimpsest and with it expose a past brutally at odds with the country's political mythology. The architecture of this mythology has rested on two fraught notions: community and nation. Neither is unique to Pakistan, which, like Israel, enjoys the rare distinction of embodying a form of religious nationalism that involved the transformation of a religious community into a nation. Other suggestive points of comparison have also been noted. Both countries shared a vision of themselves as a refuge for the persecuted. Both attracted the hostility of the religious establishment. Both sought to balance the expression of communal interests with demands to justify them on religious grounds. And both held to the vision of impregnable fortresses dedicated to the creation of just and humane societies. Yet, what distinguished Pakistan were the grounds that defined the transition of the Muslims of British India from a religious community into a nation with political aspirations. At its simplest, it involved the assumption that a distinct religious identity, Islam, had forged a monolithic community that predisposed Muslims to assume a separate identity, which determined all other lines of social and political difference. The real significance of this identity lay in the ostensibly special status of Muslims that was seen to rest above all on their preeminent claim to power. It flowed from the experience of Muslim dominance in India, which reinforced the idea that an essential part of being Muslim entailed belonging to or identifying with the ruling power. But it also derived from an Islamically informed discourse that valued power as an instrument in the service of God's law. This collective consciousness was frustrated by the search for consensus over the definition of an Indian Muslim community, a difficulty that was compounded not only by divisions of region and class that eroded the binding force of a common religion, but by the multiple meanings attached to Islam itself. They reflected the extreme doctrinal and ideological complexity of the Islamic tradition. Yet, with just a few exceptions, an awareness of this diversity among South Asian Muslims, including Muslim intellectuals and ideologues, has generally not produced a positive pattern of acceptance, acknowledgement, or appreciation for that diversity. This was nowhere as pertinent as in the understanding of the notion of a Muslim community, an idea that has been more fundamental to Pakistan than the relatively recent construction of a Muslim nation upon which the country is assumed to rest. Indeed, no explanation of the relationship between religion and nationalism in Pakistan would be complete without addressing the idea of the Muslim community. It formed the very basis of the claim by the father of the nation, Jinnah, who declared Indian Muslims a nation precisely because they represented a community defined by Islam. Though the meanings attached to this community in South Asia have been infinitely varied, the epistemological value attached to the idea of a communal consensus in Islam has consistently challenged the broad acceptance of these multiple meanings. The legacy of a community whose internal differences were said to have frustrated the Muslim quest for consensus also profoundly influenced Pakistan's efforts to describe the nation as a political concept. Just as the multiple meanings of the Muslim community in India were once judged to undermine its authority as a focus of individual allegiance, so too have the multiple meanings of Pakistan presented an enduring problem, one that must be solved in order to transcend the social and political cleavages that undermine Pakistan's claim to a national identity. But while many had hoped that the substance of this identity would be strengthened by the ready made assumptions of a putative Muslim community, Pakistan's history has merely underscored the deeply contested meanings of the latter. Who is a Pakistani? Nowhere has the lack of consensus over the meaning of Pakistan and its ambiguous relation to Islam surfaced more sharply than in doubts over the definition of the Pakistani, a definition that is still deeply contested. Soon after independence, conflicting discourses of Pakistan as both a point of destination for Indian Muslims and a consolidated center of Muslim power accentuated tensions between Muslim migrants and indigenous groups, each armed with rival versions of the Pakistani. On the one side were the moral claims of Muslim refugees from India, who sought to establish their preeminence as real Pakistanis by comparing their migration to the archetypal Muslim exodus led by the Prophet Muhammad to establish the first Islamic community in 7th century Arabia. On the other, there prevailed the political logic of so-called sons of the soil, who appealed to their demonstrable roots in the regions of Pakistan. This conflict to establish the alpha citizens of the new country was symptomatic of the lack of resolution between two opposing ideas of political belonging that had informed the idea of Pakistan. The first resting on the ideational constructions of a natural Muslim community, the second on the notion of a locally negotiated national community. In the late 1960s, this struggle developed in a tandem with a related discourse on the Pakistani as Muslim, whose wide-ranging implications were reflected in the civil war that led to the breakup of the country in 1971. They centered on attempts by the Bengali majority to strengthen an ethnic definition of the Pakistani in opposition to others that favored an identity more closely tied to Islam. Although these efforts were brutally suppressed, they radically challenged the two-nation theory that emphasized allegiance to Islam over regional loyalties as that of being Pakistani. Pakistan's altered contours after 1971 precipitated fresh uncertainties over its identity, which now assumed more complex forms. At issue were perceived attempts to Punjabize it, which triggered a reaction among the country's smaller regional groups, especially those of Sindh and Balochistan, where there emerged a strong shift in favor of more plural expressions of Pakistani identity. The country's turn towards the Islamic lands lying to the west of Pakistan also encouraged fresh interest in equating the Pakistani with the Muslim. The hardening of the state's Islamic identity in the 1980s intensified all these concerns, but also sharpened sectarian differences that fostered the preference for a certain type of Sunni sectarian Islam as a defining feature of the universal Pakistani. Together, these currents have significantly weakened the drive to achieve a pluralism-friendly definition of Pakistani identity. The persistent lack of consensus over Islam and its role in relation to the state further undermined this effort. Its consequences have contributed towards the dismantling of institutional protection for the country's non-Muslim minorities and fueled doubts about their claims to qualify as real Pakistanis. The burden of Islam. It would seem self-evident that as a Muslim homeland built in the name of Islam, Pakistan would be better equipped than most states to define the role of Islam in national politics. Yet, the debate on the place of Islam in national life has raged on, muddied by the claims and counterclaims of its many protagonists. That it should continue to do so is in very large measure a reflection, if not a symptom, of the ideological confusion at the heart of a state still trapped in the midst of its own making. All states rely on myths, which they nurture to lend meaning to the imagined political community. What is peculiar to Pakistan is that the myths so carefully cultivated to sustain the national edifice turned out after independence to be embarrassments that needed to be shrouded from view or embellished in ways that made them more palatable. So it was that the carefully cultivated myth of Pakistan as a nation of Muslims ill at ease with Indian secularism came to weigh heavily upon the country's first generation of leaders. Prompted by their own secular leanings, they chose to reconcile their quest for a modern constitutional framework based on religion by claiming that Islam was not a mere religion, but the blueprint for a comprehensive social and political order capable of adapting to the modernity of nationalism. In doing so, they drew heavily on an established modernist tradition of Indo-Muslim thinking that aimed to free Islam from the pre-modern associations commonly attached to religion. At the head of this campaign was Muhammad Iqbal, who, although significantly more radical in his thinking than his predecessors Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Amir Ali, like them proclaimed modernity to be Islam's birthright. But this claim was also implicit in Jinnah's understanding of Islam as modern. As Metcalfe has perceptively observed, while Jinnah's cosmopolitanism inclined him, like Nehru, to regard religion as archaic, what singled him out from his secular-minded peers in Congress was the claim that Islam was not a religion, a view he then used formally to buttress the claim in March 1940 that the Muslims were a nation, not a religion. The problem of India, he declared, is not of an intercommunal character but manifestly of an international one, and it must be treated as such. Nor, he later added, were Islam and Hinduism religions in the strict sense of the word. They were two nations. Jinnah, no romantic, soon realized that while the principles of Islam might represent a panacea for the resolution of the Muslim nation or national questions, they were unlikely to help address the real shortcomings of Muslim society. These shortcomings were brutally exposed at partition when Muslims demonstrated that the primeval impulses of their religion remained dangerously in place. By August 1947, Jinnah was forced to recognize that whatever the national claims on behalf of Islam, he could not tame the Islamic tiger. In his famous inaugural speech to the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly, he appeared to acknowledge the damaging effects flowing from the use of religious rhetoric to justify his demand for Pakistan. You will find, he observed, that in the course of time Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense as citizens of the state. Many have since interpreted this extraordinary restatement of Jinnah's vision as evidence of his unequivocal preference for a secular state, although he did not significantly go as far as to use the word secular. But Jinnah's speech also fueled fears among others who wondered whether he had reneged on his commitment to the new country's founding ideology, the two-nation theory. While neither claim has ever been decisively established, what it suggested was that Jinnah, having mobilized Islam's vote winning potential, now sought to curb its destructive power by confining religion to the private sphere. It would set the tone for future battles over conflicting conceptions of Pakistan.